You're listening to the Critical Hour on Radio Sputnik. I'm Wilmer Leon, joined here by my co-host Garland Nixon.
Thank you, Wilmer.
AfricaNews.com reports Denmark to close embassies in Mali and Burkina Faso. Denmark said it will close its embassies as part of its new strategy for cooperation with Africa. For insight into this, let's turn to our next guest. He holds the John J. and Rebecca Boers Chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. He's one of the most prolific writers of our time. His latest book is entitled Armed Struggle: Panthers and Communists, Black Nationalists and Liberals in Southern California through the 60s and 70s. Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, welcome back.
Thank you for inviting me.
The Foreign Ministry said yesterday that military coups in both countries had limited, quote, the scope for action in the Sahel region, end quote. Instead, it plans to open new missions in Senegal, Tunisia, and Rwanda, and increase its diplomatic workforce in its embassies in Egypt, Kenya, South Africa, Nigeria, and Ghana. Your thoughts on what this signals, Dr. Horne, and what got my attention was closing these embassies as part of its new strategy for cooperation. New strategy and cooperation, to me, seem to be code language. What does that really mean, Dr. Horne?
What it really means is that Denmark, which, as you know, is a member in good standing of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, has decided, along with its comrades in Washington, London, and elsewhere in the North Atlantic, to begin to try to isolate diplomatically the alliance of Sahel states, including Burkina Faso, Niger, and Mali, because this alliance has moved ever closer to Russia, to China, particularly Niger, which, as you know, has ousted not only French military from its soil, but also U.S. military, which is thought to be placing in jeopardy the enormous uranium deposits in that Sahel state, which heretofore have been going to France to power electricity at a pittance. At the same time, you see that the alliance of Sahel states is being pulverized to a certain degree by religious zealotry. And I think if you begin to dig a bit more deeply, you may be able to detect a kind of de facto alliance between the North Atlantic countries and some of the Gulf Arab states, including affluent Gulf Arab individuals who are funding these religious zealots who disguise themselves as Muslims. Recall that it was just in the last 24 hours that you had scores of civilians in Burkina Faso who were massacred in a bloody fashion with this crime laid at the doorstep of religious zealots. So I think that we have to place this recent move by Denmark in that context. And as well, we should pay attention to the relationship between Mali, another anchor state of the Alliance of Sahel States, and its northern neighbor, speaking of Morocco, which is quite close to the North Atlantic countries, and that has been the case historically, going back centuries. And that has manifested most recently with Morocco signing the so-called sellout Abraham Accords, providing a gift to the piratical state of Israel in terms of a kind of de facto recognition. At the same time, Morocco moving to annex further the Western Sahara, which has been smiled upon by France, the former colonial master. At the same time, Algeria, a northern neighbor of the Sahel states, is not necessarily in the good books of France, the former colonial master, because it has contradictions and grievances unresolved with Morocco. It is sought to bolster the Sahel states diplomatically. Similarly, if you look at the economic community of West African states, spearheaded by the continent's giant, speaking of Nigeria, the giant both in terms of population and in terms of size of the economy, you see that the Sahel states have slowly withdrawn from ECOWAS, the Economic Community of West African States, which has not been smiled upon by Nigeria. And of course, we all know that the United States has Mr. Tinubu, the leader of Nigeria. They have him by the hair because he is facing these charges of drug dealing and other sorts of crimes during his tenure in the United States in the 1970s. And likewise, with regard to other states in the region, we know that both Sierra Leone and Liberia are fundamentally creations of Washington and London going back centuries, and you can expect them to side with London and Washington. And so the scenario for the Sahel states is very complex, very complicated, and has not been made less so by this recent maneuver by Denmark.
Africa News reports fighting resumes in eastern DR Congo. In a press statement released on Monday, the DRC Army said rebels launched their attack on Army positions in the village of Kikubu in violation of a ceasefire. Your thoughts, Dr. Horne?
Well, ostensibly, this conflict involves a conflict between Rwanda and the DRC. That is to say, post the genocide in Rwanda, post 1994, Kigali, that is to say, Rwanda, officially has accused those who perpetrated the genocide of retreating to eastern Congo, and Kigali has argued that their presence there provides a clear and present danger to the continued independence and sovereignty of Rwanda. The larger context is that the Democratic Republic of Congo is larger than Western Europe in terms of territory. It's a storehouse of resources, not least cobalt and coltan, the latter being ubiquitous in smartphones, and historically, as a result, has attracted the negative attention of the North Atlantic powers, going all the way back to the bad old days of the African slave trade, when you had U.S. enslavers sailing up the Congo River and curious Congolese coming to the banks of the river to see who these visitors were, could oftentimes be snatched and within weeks find themselves toiling on plantations in Mississippi and Louisiana. And so we also see that a few decades after the end of the U.S. Civil War, that there was the Congress of Berlin where the African continent was carved up like a Thanksgiving turkey, with King Leopold of Belgium claiming this swath of territory known as the Congo as his personal fiefdom. This was taking place as rubber was becoming a valuable commodity as the automobile age was jumping off. And rubber also was and is, to a degree, a commodity that characterizes the Congo. What happens is that there is de facto slave labor employed to tap these rubber plants, with these subsequent commodity being shipped to Akron, Ohio to make tires for cars for Ford, General Motors, etc. And so this rather nasty process was disrupted about 60-odd years ago when in early 1960, late 1959, you saw a movement for independence in Congo began to accelerate under the leadership of Congolese patriot Patrice Lumumba. Alas, shortly thereafter, he was assassinated with the complicity of the U.S. CIA, confessed to openly by the former station chief, speaking of Larry Devlin, not Devil, in a widely circulated memoir. That leads to the rise of the thief and kleptocrat Joseph Mobutu, a U.S. placeman, a close comrade of Ronald Wilson Reagan. But fortunately, he was overthrown about 30-odd years ago. And this happened not least because of the activity of neighboring Uganda and, yes, the Rwandans under the current Rwandan leader, Paul Kagame, and his Rwandan Patriotic Front. But what happens with the fall of Mobutu and the rise of the Kabila's father and son taking his place is that instability does not cease in Congo. And of course, it has not ceased today under the current leader, Mr. Tshisekedi, who is backed by Israel, particularly the Israeli billionaire Dan Gertler, who has his grubby little paws over a good deal of the natural resources of the Congo. Once again, what's happened is that the international community has tried to intervene, and there has been an international force there that includes Kenya, which is obviously a stretch thin, since it's also in Haiti, and also South Africa, which is not amply supplied, which is leading to a lot of disgruntlement in Pretoria. And so this situation in the Eastern Congo is made to order, for disorder, I'm afraid to say, not least because Rwanda has substantial support from the North Atlantic community. Recall that under former British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, there was a deal to send migrants into Britain who had arrived without papers to Rwanda. That was blocked by the incoming Prime Minister Starmer, but the close relations between Rwanda and the North Atlantic countries continues to persist, and that is the backstory of this Africa news story about the continuing conflict in Eastern Congo.
We have just about 2.5 minutes left, but really wanted to get your take on this. And this is from Common Dreams. Why are liberal Zionists cheering as Harris echoes Biden on Gaza? J Street is eager to define the limits of acceptable criticism of Israeli government policies from the Democratic Party establishment, setting aside human rights as secondary to the mantra of Israel's right to exist. Dr. Horne.
Well, I'm afraid to inform J Street and other so-called liberal Zionists that it's easy to foresee and predict a coming crisis in the U.S.-Israeli alliance. I say this despite the story in USA Today about hundreds of shipments of arms taking place from the United States to Israel, taking place as we speak, which obviously calls into question the ability of the United States to be an honest broker, to be a mediator in this conflict, which is the role that is assuming. But the problem for U.S. imperialism is that it's being all in with regard to Israel is leading to reputational damage, not only in the region, but globally, and allowing the People's Republic of China to score points. You see this with regard to China bringing together Palestinian factions a few weeks ago, including Hamas and Fatah, signing on to an enhanced declaration. You see this with regard to China brokering a kind of entente between Iran and Saudi Arabia. And you see it as well in the fact that ultimately the U.S. ruling class sees China as the major antagonist, would like to cut its losses elsewhere so it could focus like a laser beam on China. But that's becoming ever more difficult given this quagmire in Israel. And at the same time, you see Israel itself is dependent to a certain degree upon China. Recall, we've talked many times about the credible stories about Israeli officialdom leaking sophisticated U.S. military technology to China. Israel has been close historically to Russia, particularly by Prime Minister Netanyahu. And so it's not difficult to foresee that this is an unsustainable relationship, and you begin to see glimmerings of this with regard to the so-called Christian nationalists. I point you to Candace Owens, the black woman flamethrower.
Okay. We got to go, Dr. Horne. As always, thank you much. Greatly appreciate that analysis, and we look forward to having you back.